Him be the glory. He absolutely is. Tell them, I am has sent you. And so, on this 10th anniversary of the Bethlehem Conference for the Supremacy of God in Pastors, my desire is as strong as ever that God might inflame in you a passion for His centrality and supremacy in your ministry, so that people will say of you when you are dead and gone, He knew God. He loved God. He showed us God week in and week out. He was, as the apostle says, filled with all the fullness of God. Ephesians 3:19. Make that your prayer like it was the apostles' prayer for the Ephesians. Now this is my aim and this is my burden for the Bethlehem Conference and for my life and for this church and for you and for your churches and for the nations, because it's implicit in the sheer being of God. It's explicit in the teachings of the Bible. From Him, through Him, and to Him are all things. In Him we live and move and have our being. He's the end point. As John MacArthur ended on this morning, the glory of God is where Paul ends it all. He ends it all there every time. The glory of God. But also, not just those two reasons, but because next year's speaker, David Wells, thank God he said yes finally. I've asked him for year after year after year because I love this man. Everything he writes, I just say, yes, David. Yes, David. And one of the things he said that is so right is, it is this God, majestic and holy in His being, who has disappeared from the modern evangelical world. And then just in the most recent, it's December Christianity Today. Did you read that article about Leslie Newbigin? Raise your hand if you read that article. Okay, not many, but it's good. It's a good article. You remember what he said there? He said, I suddenly saw, now this is just David Wells from a British perspective. I suddenly saw, he writes, that someone could use all the language of evangelical Christianity, and yet the center was fundamentally the self. My need of salvation. God is auxiliary to that. I also saw, he writes, that quite a lot of evangelical Christianity can easily slip, can become centered in me and my need of salvation and not in the glory of God. And oh, have we slipped. How many are the churches today? I ask you, how many churches do you know where the dominant aroma, sound, feel, expression is the preciousness of the weight of the glory of God? How many are there? Now, John Calvin saw in his own day the same thing that Leslie Newbigin saw in India and in Britain the last 50 years. And in 1538, the Italian Cardinal Sadolet, trying to win back the city of Geneva, which had turned over to the Reformation just before Calvin came, trying to win them back, writing to the city council, had written a long introductory section extolling the preciousness of eternal life before he gets to his vicious criticisms of the Reformation and John Calvin in particular. Well, Calvin was asked to write the response to this in the fall of 1539. He did it in 6 days. Luther read it and said, "Here is a writing with hands and feet." Luther was 25 years older than John Calvin and admired him. Melanchthon stood in awe of John Calvin. John Calvin called him the theologian with trembling. Calvin's response to Sadolet is important because, and you can read it in this book. I recommend that you all have this book in your library. This is a collection. This is for Luther. Dillenberger did for Calvin what he did for his Luther collection. Get the Luther collection and the Calvin collection. Then you got everything you need right here. You don't need to buy anything else of John Calvin. You don't need it. But you can if you want to. I have a few others under here, like these. You can read this there, the response to Sadolet. One of the first things John Calvin wrote, established him as the reformer of Europe when he wrote it, didn't deal first with justification. Didn't deal first with priestly abuses. Didn't deal first with transubstantiation. Didn't deal first with praying to the saints. Didn't deal first with papal authority. All those come in for powerful treatment. But what he deals with first proves to be, I believe, the integrating issue of his life, the whole explanation of how he got to be who he was and why his theology was what it was, why the world is today what it is under the influence of Calvinism. It is the fundamental issue for John Calvin. It comes out over and over and over again, namely, the centrality and the supremacy of the majesty and the glory of God. For example, he sees in Sadolet's puff of piety at the beginning something that Newbigin saw. Here's the way Calvin puts it. Your zeal for heavenly life is a zeal which keeps a man devoted to himself and does not even by one expression arouse him to sanctify the name of God. Sanctify the name of God. Your whole treatment of eternal life never even got to the main issue of whether going there should be for the glory of God. Calvin's chief contention with Rome comes out in his writings over and over again, is that you can take true language and skew it so badly that it loses its whole center and foundation. What Calvin aims to do is something very different. So he goes on and he says, this is what you should do, Sadolet. Quote, set before man as the prime motive of his existence zeal to illustrate the glory of God. Now there's the banner over John Calvin's life, preaching, and theology. Zeal, there's passion, to illustrate the glory of God. The essential meaning of John Calvin's life and preaching is that he recovered and he embodied a passion for the absolute reality, God is, and majesty of God. Benjamin Warfield wrote a big book that David Livingston loaned me on Augustine and Calvin. And it's pretty profound stuff. And he says, no man ever had a profounder sense of God than John Calvin. And that's the key to his life. No particular doctrine, not predestination, not election, not justification by faith, is the key that unlocks the life of John Calvin. Gerhardus Voss wrote a very powerful essay. You should get Voss's collected shorter writings. They don't call it Puritan Reform. Presbyterian and Reformed, it was called when it was published in 1980. Maybe it's still that. But you can get it. And in this essay, He writes about Reformed theology versus Lutheran